Welcome to Crosstown Cardboard episode 53 with myself, Carmine at Carmine's Cards, Craig at New York City Sports Cards, and we have a special guest today. That's Matthew at 1956 Tops Guy. And Craig, we're talking about with our special guest challenging hobby assumptions, which of course, with us, the conversation could go anywhere after bouncing back and forth. But real quick, what do you think about that topic, Craig, and the wonderful guest with all the experience he has to talk about this?
Yeah, I'm excited to chop it up with Matthew, who I got a chance to meet briefly at National. And Matt, I was going through
We met
your,
him together. We met him at the
yeah,
same time. Yep.
very good. You showed us the custom. I want to say it was the Ernie Banks autograph,
Yeah, that's right.
and you came in wearing the Cubs hat, so it was perfect. But if you go to your Instagram, 1956 Tops Guy, I love that you have in the caption "Hobby Nerd" because that is exactly how I see it for myself too. I'm just a card nerd. So you're in great company. So Matt, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing fantastically. I'm super glad to be chatting it up with you guys, especially, as kind of like an avid listener, someone who's been really kind of interested in following your guys' like hobby journey. It's cool that, we got to meet in person at the National, and I'm excited about chopping it up with you today.
That's great. That's great. First of all, what an honor for somebody to who has this much experience in the hobby and has such a unique and cool collecting lane to be listening to our podcast. And I was screenshotting a few of your story posts about, Craig said hobby nerd, also physicist. So that kind of aligns also.
So hobby nerd and a regular nerd.
Yeah, I'm a nerd all the time in my hobby life and my professional life. Yeah.
Perfect. And so I was seeing some of your story posts, and this is aligning with the nerd thing, which again we think is a compliment. Craig, I don't know if you saw this. It was like a few days ago, and once I knew that we were getting Matthew on, I started really, studying up. So he has a story post. What's your PC card intake process? And then goes through, which I was like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I have an intake process, Craig, I'm sure you do when you get a new card, and 10 specific things Matthew listed on here of what exactly he does as far as cleaning up the slab, scanning the card, putting the slab into a sleeve, resorting a Flickr album, uploading JPEG to cloud. So Matthew, why have you, and maybe it's just in your nature, but why have you decided to not only nerd out on the hobby, but be so comfortable sharing that with people and making that like your thing that you're giving back to the hobby?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Carmine. So what went into my thinking in posting that was, you know, being in the hobby, it's really easy to be in a mode where you're just like constantly in acquisition mode, where it's like you're just searching around for this particular card. You finally get it, and then you get it home, and then it's on to the next one, right? And one thing I was trying to think about was, what are the ways that I try to squeeze every last drop of enjoyment out of the new card that I just got. So like I don't get very many cards, so I probably get maybe, I don't know, on average maybe like one every 2 weeks or something like that. And
Yeah.
so and usually I spend like a lot of time like trying to find, these particular cards. And so when I get them in, I'm trying to squeeze every last drop of enjoyment. And for me, that's kind of like, I kind of want to make sure that like, number one, like the card like looks good, so that if the case is a little bit banged up, try to like clean it up and stuff like that. But being a nerd, and like when I was a kid, a big thing that I loved about cards was like organizing them and like reorganizing them. Like I remember putting them in like binder pages and then like moving them around when I got new ones, because I cared about like the order a lot, like so that visually it kind of presented a certain way. And so that's kind of carries over in my collecting now, when I want to like both like take the physical card and like put it in the collection among my other cards, like in a specific order, not just like flung into a box. But I also want like to take like the high quality digital image and also organize it in a way that makes sense with my other cards. And so like for me, a big thing is like when I get a new card in, I have a nice scanner, I scan that card. And so then I have and then when I upload it to Flickr, that is a way for me to like enjoy my cards when I'm not at home, Like I really like looking at my cards. And so if I have a really high quality image that's like on Flickr, or, choose whatever app you want, that then you can, I'm at work and I'm a little bit bored. I want to see something cool. Instead of me perusing eBay, looking at the new card, I want to look at the cards I have. Right. And so that whole process of like taking the image, putting the image in the right spot, prepping it for like how I want to display it on Instagram, those are all things that like allow me to nerd out and really kind of focus in on that one card and like really like get every last drop of enjoyment from it.
I could relate to that. I don't have a high image scanner, but I do have natural lighting. So when I take a picture of a card, I make sure to get the perfect lighting. And it's a good point you make about looking at it, because that's almost like a metric for a card that really means something to you. When I post something on Instagram and I continue to look at that card throughout the course of a day, 2 days, 3 days after posting it, that's how you know a card's really special to you.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Carmine? Do you do like when you get a card, you go out to the mailbox, you get your card, what do you do with it?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I don't think I've talked about this at all in 52 episodes so far of Crosstown Cardboard. When I get it, I get a feeling of excitement, and then I'm, juiced up coming back into the house. And then sometimes I save it until, like, I don't always open it right away. Sometimes I save it. Let's say I'm cooking dinner. I want to have a moment to fully enjoy seeing it for the first time. Because like we've talked about on one of our early episodes, our Mount Rushmore of what we look for in a card. And one of my most important things was the first impression, like within 3 seconds. I mean, I'm sure you probably you can know just the registration. I mean, of course, you're doing more vintage stuff with being the 56 Topps guy, but the centering, the registration, it's amazing how quickly you can make a read on, a card that really hits you.
And it's different in hand, right? It's different.
Oh, way different, way different. And then I'll probably put it on my card stand in my little rectangular photo booth that a lot of people probably get them off Amazon, and you have the background and good lighting, and take a few pictures, take some couple with an artsy angle, and but it's hard to avoid the glare. I know a lot of people talk about, especially us natural lighting guys, but you got the scanner, so it's like a controlled environment. But
so then what happens? You take the picture, then what happens?
I take the picture, and usually I have a few cards that maybe I got in at the same time. I stack them up. I'll look at the card underneath the light, just looking at it and enjoying it that way. But then honestly, I put it away and I don't really look at my cards that much. I don't feel like it lessens the excitement of it till, like some people say, oh, I can only say I love you so many times because it hurts the feeling of it. I feel like sometimes for me, just knowing that I have that card, hits me in the feelings rather than looking at it all the time. So, but I probably should look at it more because, I mean, the work that we all put into acquire cards like this and the money that it took. But so why don't we get into our challenging hobby assumptions, Matthew, because I'm curious, when we were going back and forth, after meeting at National and then talking about you coming on our podcast, we were talking about topics, and of course we could have hit a bunch of different things. Why did you think challenging hobby assumptions was one that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I thought of it because if I think about the hobby from a new collector point of view, it's really easy to just kind of like do what everybody else does, right? It's really easy to be like, okay, what's the new hotness? How do I kind of get in on this, right? And it's really easy to kind of like suddenly find yourself in a situation where you're like, wait, I don't really have like a lot of connection to these cards. I kind of just got them because that's what everybody else is doing. And so what I mean by assumptions is kind of like, everything that you think is true about the hobby right now is not necessarily going to be true in 10 years or in 5 years, right? If I think back to even 10 years ago, and I think about BGS and PSA, it was completely different ball game than it is right now. Yeah. And it's really kind of like unrealistic to think that the hobby 10 years from now is going to look like the hobby it is today. Like, is PSA 10 going to be the king of everything? Is there's all these questions that you can ask. And so I guess what I would want people to think about is maybe care less about what it is now and think more about like, what do you want it to be? And then kind of do that. Like, you think about, like, there are these guys, right, in the old days who used to there were people who got their cards signed by like Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays. And at the time, people were like, that's a stupid thing to do. You just chuck the value of that card right out the window because you had someone sign it. But right now, those cards are like super hot, right? And so the assumption that the card was being ruined by having someone sign it, it's wrong, right? It didn't remain true. And I feel like there's many different ways that you could take that thought and apply it to today's hobby, and maybe challenge some of those ideas that it kind of the hobby holds to be true right now, and really examine, like, does that make sense to me, or do I believe that, and use that to kind of guide your collecting. So maybe one more quick story. So one thing that really pushed me into vintage cards was this must have been like 2016, 2017. I had a really nice Mike Trout rookie, and I got it graded by PSA, and it started just climbing in value to the point where I was like, this is kind of a nuts number. I mean, and this was before the hobby blew up, but even at that time, it was kind of a crazy number. And then I started looking at, like, okay, if I just go to a different segment of the hobby and just had that amount of money, what could I get? Right. And that's when I saw, like, oh, actually, like, I could sell this card and I could just buy a Babe Ruth. Like, that was shocking.
Wow.
Right. And it wasn't like a Babe Ruth that like got hit by a bus. It was like a Babe Ruth that, its corners are rounded or something like that. But it was still a freaking Babe Ruth card. Right. And so at that time, like, that didn't make sense to me, that like there was this Mike Trout card that was worth the same as this Babe Ruth. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to sell a bunch of my stuff and I'm going to buy a bunch of this old stuff because it didn't make sense to me. Whether or not, like, in 10 years I'm right, my thought process was correct. I mean, I don't know, but it's certainly true that from my own personal value perspective, the Mike Trout was cool because I pulled it myself, but it's not Babe Ruth, right? It's not Babe Ruth. And so that was like an easy assumption that I was kind of like, yeah, I'm not cool with that. I'm just going to go ahead and like go in this other direction. And that's kind of what I was thinking when I proposed the topic.
Wow. So you turned a Mike Trout rookie into a Babe Ruth. And what year Babe Ruth was that?
At 33 Gaudi.
Wow.
Not bad. Not bad for a card that you pack pulled.
Yeah.
So you talk about hobby assumptions. Well, the problem is nowadays, and you said you don't transact as much, but you're still aware that people love the hot new prospect, the football, whoever the new quarterback is, or up and coming NBA rookie. Because I think a lot of the hobby now, at least the mainstream hobby that we see, is fueled by gambling. I'm not a big gambler myself. So people who are buying these quarterbacks hoping to buy it and flip it. So if I'm going to challenge the hobby assumptions, it's buy the prospect, play the seasons. I try to look for cards that are timeless, that are not dependent on the time of year, the season, or anything of such. I always like to give examples, So I was just showing you this card before, and it's not the most expensive card, but I'll tell you what, this card here is quite different. And this is the 2010 National Treasures Octo autograph. 8 on-card autographs. Sam Bradford, Tim Tebow, Jimmy Clausen, Colt McCoy, CJ Spiller, Ryan Matthews, Javid Best, and Toby Gerhart. But I use this card as an example. It doesn't matter if it's football season, basketball season. I'm not worried about playing the cycles. This is a card that I will pick up at any time. And I think that shift in mindset has helped me tremendously when I go to shops and I go to shows and I'm looking for stuff. It doesn't matter what time of year it is. Is that card going to be timeless? Is it always going to be unique to me? That's what I look for.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's kind of like, I'm not trying to like crap on people who do prospecting. Like, if you do prospecting, and you think it's fun, like go for it, But it's kind of like, yeah, there's not this, you get this feeling like you're missing out if you don't like hit it big, right? Like that if you don't find that prospect that turns into the next Mike Trout, and then you've somehow like failed, right? And then but that's kind of like, I don't know. I just don't that. I feel like if you're in the hobby long enough, you kind of, see enough of these things happen that you're kind of like, yeah, that's maybe not for me. And maybe the thing that I'm going to do is chase things that either, have like a deeper meaning to me for one reason or another. Or like in your case, Craig, it's like something that you're like, yeah, I can definitely see a collector base for this card, even if what independent kind of what happens in the next 3-month time scale. And I guess that's another piece of it that we talked about, is a little bit about time scales, right? Like if you're certainly trying to flip things over a short time scale, then like what the hobby values right now matters a great deal. If you're building a collection that you think you're going to care about 10 years from now, then not so much, right?
Yeah, no, that's well said. That's yeah, I feel like the risk is a little bit too much for me also with the prospecting thing, and I've slowly been paring down. I mean, at National, me and Craig were walking around and we're trying to it was difficult for us, and I felt kind of proud of us, that it was difficult for us to find something that we were really interested in, because we've both, kind of shrunk our collecting lane and done. And of course it has to do with the market, coming back
Mhm.
down to much more normal levels than it was at a boiling point fever pitch, during the pandemic, where you could buy a lot of different stuff and you could easily move it and people had more cash to spend. But and I felt that, like, I was at the casino actually with Big Ken, our boy, sports card lessons. And we went to the casino one night after the National, right there in Rosemont. And we're gambling. And my heart was just pounding at the blackjack table. It was like ridiculous. And, I brought like $100 in. I got up to like 300. I got back down to like 50. And then I got up to 200 and I cashed out. I said $100 profit. That'll be great. Doubled my money. And I
Good for
felt
you.
so like smart. Yeah. I felt like, like you don't have to hit the lottery, like you said, Matthew, with the prospecting. But how do people, when everyone's, not everyone, but, in general, the story sales you're seeing, or a lot of the posts are, a lot of the younger quarterbacks and things like that. How do you, especially, being a scientist, I'm sure you do this, you challenge assumptions all the time, or prove or disprove, run studies and stuff like that. How do people get that mindset rather than just going with the flow of what's going on?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I guess the science side of me would answer your question by saying, like, a lot of what you see is noise, and you're spending almost all of your time kind of trying to filter out the noise and trying to find what would be called the signal. That's what you would say in physicist terms. I want a high signal to noise so I know what I'm looking at. And so it's kind of like, in this case, I think finding the signal kind of comes down to your convictions a little bit. Like kind of staying true to the path that you think you're on. Like if you're like, I think that, X, Y, or Z quarterback is gonna, do really well, and he's on my team, and I want to be a part of this, like go for it. But if you're kind of looking at it more from a perspective of, I guess when I'm flipping through Instagram, oftentimes I'm trying to see, like, does this card resonate with me for some reason or another? Like, can I find a reason that, like, it touches some part of my experience? And if it does, then then that's kind of that first barrier on your, like, Mount Rushmore checklist of, like, what a card needs to do, right? And so I feel like it's kind of like it's filtering, right? It's kind of searching through the noise to find something that has meaning or significance to you. I don't know. I mean, what do you think, Greg?
I think it's a really good feeling when you scroll through Instagram and you see a card that hits with you, and you could have the thought like, probably not a lot of other people out there will feel that same way about this card, but for me personally, it hits. I mean, again, I like to give examples. I just picked up these 3 New York Knicks because I love autographs, game worn patches. We got Bill Cartwright out of 25 in the Knicks uniform from National Treasures. We got Al Harrington, 3-color patch autograph out of 25, and our guy Jalen Brunson in a Knicks uni
Oh,
autograph game worn
Nice.
jersey. I
nice.
think altogether these cards cost me $70, which I'm not
That's pretty
saying
good.
$70 is nothing, but to acquire 3 cards that really, like, I love, doesn't matter if anyone else loves. I mean, that's what this is all about. We're collectors at the end of the day. And I am on this path of building this incredible Knicks collection. a very unique Knicks collection. So all I'm doing, I'm adding to it, and it brings me joy, and I could do so in an affordable way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it
Yeah.
makes sense.
That's cool. That's cool. And Matthew, you'd probably love the display that Craig has. He has the 1969 Topps basketball tall boys and all the Knicks from that year, which are what, like 6 or 7 guys, Craig?
So, there were 7 Knicks in the 1969 set, which was the season that they won the championship.
Yeah. And he has it like put together in a display, like a glass photo. It's
Oh, that's awesome. That's how you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's the thing where you like look and there it has like, there's all these layers of significance to you, right? Where it's like it's a cool card, like it's cool cards from a cool set, then it's all Knicks, and then it's like, the connection to that season. And so like I'm a heavy vintage card collector, but I do modern in the sense that I collect a lot of the 2016 Cubs from that World Series team. So there's a whole part of my collection that's all about collecting autographs and cool cards that are connected to that World Series run. And, that gives me tons of joy, as much joy as it does, the Mickey Mantle and the Willie Mays and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, I know you've talked about this, probably every time you've talked publicly about cards, but, for our listeners who might not know, why 1956 Topps baseball? Why did you land on that one? I know you do other stuff. I was looking at your 52 mantle, on the Instagram, which was awesome that you had. I believe it was a PSA 2. And but why 1956? Why did that really strike a chord with you?
Yeah, so this was when so I was about 25 years old, and I had stopped collecting maybe when I was like 15 or 16, and then when I was about 25, my girlfriend, who's now my wife, was asking me like, what do you want for my birthday? And I was like, damned if I know. I don't know what I want. I don't want like socks. I don't want a sweater. And I was like, I wanted something cool. So I'm like, what? Cards were cool. Let me see what cards are doing these days, right? So I got on the eBay and I was perusing, and I was like, I think it would be cool to get an older card. And so I just started researching around like, these older 1950s cards that I could remember seeing as a kid at shows and stuff. And the one I stumbled upon was, I kind of zoned in on like Ernie Banks. Like Ernie Banks, he's a Cub. He also played in this era with all these great cards. Let me see what they look like. And so when I saw the 1956 Topps Ernie Banks, I was just stunned. I'm like, this is just a beautiful card. So if you're unfamiliar with the 1956 Topps set, it's the set where it's a horizontal card, and it's not a photo. So it's the last issue of Topps where they used like an artist rendition of a photograph for the image on the card. And there's 2 images. There's I don't have one on me. I should. But there's a portrait, of the person's face, and then in the background is like a color image of like an action shot. Yeah, there you go. There's Luis Aparicio. You can see his face, and you can see him in the background jumping to catch the ball. I just thought like artistically and like visually, it was just such a cool card. And so I was like, I'm trying to get all the Cubs from 1956 Topps. Like that's kind of where it started. And then, it just cascaded from there. It was like, well, I have all the Cubs. Why didn't I just get everybody? And so the other thing that's cool, like, so it's kind of visually striking is one of the key reasons. Another big one is that there aren't, aside from that Aparicio that you just showed, all the other star cards aren't rookie cards, which makes them a little bit more inexpensive. But the set also has like all of the biggest names from the era, like Mickey Mantle and Ted Williams and Willie Mays. Yeah. And it's the last Jackie Robinson card. So, I mean, it has like, for me as like a nerd and, someone who likes, baseball cards and the history of baseball, it was like a perfect set. Yeah. There's Clemente. So the 340 card set of just pure artistic beauty of the classic greats of the game. So it's really easy to fall in love with.
And you have the entire set.
Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah. So I built the set. I have the complete set, and I finished it. So I started it in 2005, and I think I finished it in 2016. So it took a while because I was going slowly, and it was really fun to build it like one card at a time.
Now, is it all graded or not? Because when we talked about hobby assumptions, maybe vintage is a whole different ball game. But one of the assumptions I think we see nowadays is everything's got to be graded. And you can make the argument for vintage that probably is a safest bet. So how did you go about it? Did you get everything graded? You have some raw?
Oh yeah, so actually I started off, I was 25, I didn't have much money, so I was like, I'm just gonna do this whole thing raw. And probably about like maybe 2017, 2016, I sent off like a bunch of the like premier Hall of Famers off to grading. Because I just wanted to have them kind of like better protected, I guess. And then I eventually transitioned to having all of like the key Hall of Famers I have graded, but like all of the most of the commons, which is about 300 cards, I have them all raw. Because I was like, I'm not going to spend. I was just thinking about it monetarily. Like if it costs me, $10 a card, which at that time was about what it was, like $10 for a decently graded common card. I was like, well, that's $3,000. Like I can get a raw one for $1.50. Like I'd rather spend my $3,000 on a really nice Mickey Mantle or something like that, right? So that was kind of the mathematics that I kind of gamed out at the time. But I mean, I think it's kind of, yeah, to each his own. I would argue that there is value in getting everything graded, but for me as a collector, it was kind of like as cards got more expensive, it was like made more sense to get something that had been graded just from like the security point of view, like that it's not a card that's been messed with, at least with some reasonable probability. But I feel like for the commons, like who's gonna like trim like some rando dude from the 1950s? So I was like, I'm just gonna get it raw. And it was crazy because at that time, I remember I bought like a Jackie Robinson raw for $60 and it graded as 6 later, which is not, now that car is probably worth like $1,000 or something. So it was like kind of shocking how it went from like $60 raw card to whatever, a couple $100.
Wait, so why don't you educate us real quick? I know with 56, some cards have the gray back, some have the white back.
Yeah, that's right.
I used to own a Clemente,
Mhm.
and of every card that I've ever parted ways with, that was the toughest. The only reason I could live with it is because I traded it into a Sandy Koufax rookie, which I then
Nice.
gifted to my dad for Father's Day. So worth the
Classy.
time. I do miss the Clemente, but yeah, white back, gray back. Explain that to me.
Yeah, so yeah, this is deep cut now into 1956 Top Set land. So I think it's cards 1 through, I want to say like 270 were issued in both like a grayer back and a whiter back. You can see them if someone just showed you one card, you probably wouldn't see the difference, but if you see them side by side, it's pretty clear which one's a white back and which one's a gray back. Now, the important thing to know is that from a cost perspective, they're the same. It doesn't matter, except in cards 101 through 180. In that specific range, the white back is about like 5 times more rare than the gray back.
Wow.
And that's the number range that contains Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Harmon Killebrew. And so if you find like a white back Mickey Mantle, that's worth quite a bit more in the same grade than a gray back 56 Mantle. So there's some, but it's weird because if you go on the eBay, they'll say like Sandy Koufax, whiteback, and it doesn't freaking matter. Like for Sandy Koufax, grayback and whiteback, it's the same. There's no reason that one should be more expensive than the other. But in that one range, 101 to 180, there is a scarcity and price difference between whiteback and grayback.
Is that how they printed them to be 5 times more rare in that range, or how did that come about?
I think it was just one of these wacky things where they were probably using multiple companies to do the printing, and one company ended up using a card stock that was like a little bit more white than the other one, and for whatever reason they got more cards in that range from the grayback supplier than the whiteback. I don't know the details, but like for me, I don't really. I actually go by just like the beauty of the front of the card. I don't really care about the color of the back. I want the back to be like readable. They have these cool cartoons and stuff. But the whole white back, gray back thing is a bit complicated. But the only thing to remember is that it only matters for cards 101 through 180. Other than that, it doesn't matter.
Well, I like that we're having a conversation on vintage. It's not what we normally do, but we're diverse. We're diverse collectors, so we're open to it. Again, going back to the theme, hobby assumptions. Play devil's advocate and tell me, I feel like the hobby assumption is when it comes to vintage, centering is the most important end all be all. If it looks good centering, that's it. Tell me why that is so wrong.
Yeah, I think that that's really a bad way to look at it, like a dramatic reduction that loses a lot of the intention. So I think the way that I would phrase it is that eye appeal matters a lot, and eye appeal is not one to one with centering. So, for example, registration is a big thing with vintage cards, and registration means that kind of the different colors were printed onto the card at different times. And so if like one color is kind of shifted in space compared to the other color, it makes the image kind of look out of focus. And that's what we mean by registration. And
Hmm.
so if you see like PSA does not take registration into account, I think from grades like 7 and below or something like that. So you can have a card that's like dead nut centered, super sharp borders, but is unfocused, and it's still going to be a 7. But I personally would not want that card because I want a card that I can see very clearly what the image is supposed to be. And if I would rather have a well registered card than a well centered card. And so I would say that centering is important, but it's not the end all be all. There's all these other factors that also matter. And I think I've tried to the way that I think of it to myself, what eye appeal means is kind of like when I look at the card, do the positive qualities of that card really speak to me while kind of mitigating the qualities of the card that aren't so nice? And I try to apply that same principle when I'm buying modern cards. So I tend to buy a lot of like PSA 8s. Like when I'm buying Michael Jordan cards, like I'm going to buy a PSA 8. I'm not going to spend the money to buy a PSA 10 and maybe a PSA 9 if it's like in my range. But I try to really just like let my eye do the judging on the card.
That's interesting because I feel like, yeah, the registration, I mean, if you didn't know anything about card values and you were just, let's say, somebody off the street and you
Mhm.
said, which card looks the best? Probably a lot of those people, are a great percentage, maybe even the majority would say the clearest image, like the best quality photo as far as registration would be the number one factor they might choose. So it's really not a human nature assumption. It's more like our topic, a hobby assumption. But I'm interested, Matthew, because, you know, and I love that we're talking about vintage and deep diving with an expert on it. But when you say you got back into it 2005,
Mhm.
because your girlfriend at the time, now wife, was asking, "What do you want for your birthday?" By the way, great move by you. I mean, what that opened up a whole new world just from
Yeah.
from that one request. But so you've been, in the vintage space now for, back in it for like 18, almost 20 years now.
Mhm.
So has it back when you were getting into it, was it also like this hyper focus on the centering when it came to vintage, or has it slowly transitioned more into the centering lane? Like, did it used to be every factor was considered more?
Well, it's a really great question. So back in like 2005, I feel like it was kind of like there was this echelon of collector that was like the like investor collector, and they really wanted like PSA 8. At that time for a 1956 tops, it was kind of like PSA 8 was kind of investor grade, and PSA 7 was about at the border, and PSA 6 and below was kind of like what was considered collector grade. And so at that time, it felt to me like there was a at least the people that I kind of hung around with, um, weren't super focused on centering, but they also weren't super focused on the grade overall. Um, I think it certainly over time the grading thing became to be a really big deal because of it really created a kind of a natural language for people to have a communication about how much is this thing worth, right? It kind of
Mhm.
made that process easier, especially for buying cards online. It's certainly true that maybe within the last 2 years, the emphasis on eye appeal has really started to become apparent in the market. So if you have like a PSA 2 that's a very high eye appeal card that will easily like match up to like a PSA 4 or like a high PSA 3 if it's a really really nice example. And so there's certainly a recognition now that eye appeal matters a lot to the market, and it goes the price of a vintage card is certainly not set just by the number that's on the holder, but it's really the eye appeal of the card. And it's certainly true that centering is a big piece of that. But I would say it's kind of this combination of like color, registration, and centering are the primary drivers of what people consider to be a high eye appeal card.
I think that's fair. I look at modern cards, especially iconic sets like 56 Tops, as the closest thing the hobby is to art. You know, like these 2022 National Treasures RPAs. Like, I don't look at that as art, but I do look at vintage cards as like a piece of art that you want to preserve. You could put it in a museum. So for that reason, sure, eye appeal is quite important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like one thing that I want to say about that art comment is like if you look at the 56 Tops mantle, so that's my 56 Tops mantle. So one thing that's super cool about this card is that so the photo that was taken to make this card, mantle doesn't make the catch. You can see in the artist rendition, of course he makes the catch, right? Because he's Mickey Mantle. The other thing that you can see that's really cool actually is you can see there's some people in the stands that if you look really closely, there's the same person here as over here, like this guy in the tie. It's the same guy here as over here. And some people are confused when they look at this card. They're like, wait, why is this guy like not looking at Mantle? He's looking the wrong way. Well, that's because that's actually this guy. And they just copied him over to make the stands look more full. So that whole row of people over there are just copies of the people on the other side. And so what I like about that is an example of these old cards is that like the artist was kind of free, like had some license to make the image a little bit cooler than it really was. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that, like you can see a lot of the pictures in 1956 Tops are, you know, they're based on a real photo, but sometimes there's embellishments to make it seem like more exciting or more fun than it was. And the mantle's a classic example of that. And that's one of the reasons, like, I love that, like, that art side of the hobby that really comes out in kind of 1956 and earlier issues.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
that's
I
cool.
never would have thought to look for the dual people. We're sure it wasn't like Twin Day at Yankee Stadium or anything.
No, there's a whole row of people that are exact duplicate of the people, like, you know, a couple rows over, and they're all looking in the wrong directions. Very funny.
That's funny. And you get a 2-for-1. I mean, with the portrait standard photo, like a team image almost, but an artist rendition, and then the action shot, like the 2-in-1. And that's Clemente's rookie year, right? 56.
That's the year after. 55 is
okay.
is the rookie.
Okay.
But yeah.
And you said it's the last year of Jackie Robinson?
It's Jackie Robinson's last card is 1956 Tops. And that's another one that's like super awesome because so one thing that's really cool about the card. So here's my card. I'll try to put it right so you can see it. So what's really just awesome about this card is like look at the action image. You see him sliding into home, right? But the batter is right there. That's because he stole home.
Right.
So like that's something that when I think of Jackie Robinson, you think of him as this really bold like player, and that's one of his special moves, right? Was stealing home because he's such an awesome guy. And the fact like that's captured on that card just makes it puts it over the top. It's such a cool card.
That's great. I love how you phrase it. He's stealing home because he's such an awesome guy. That's just like I love the combination of the nerdiness and the childlike joy that the hobby brings out, because not too many places can you have 10 steps to intake cards and explain the guy stealing home as being an awesome guy. I just love that you know can come from the same experience. You're muted, Craig.
I think you're muted, Craig.
I was saying it's not his speed and it's not his ability to read pitchers that allowed him to steal home. It's just awesome. Jackie Robinson being awesome.
Right. That's great. Well, yeah, Matthew. So I know you don't only do 1956 Tops because we know you have the 52 mantle. Let's say outside of, you know, continuing to collect that set, and you mentioned you have a completed set of it. What are the qualities or what makes you want to collect a card that doesn't fall into 56 Tops?
So I like to think about my collection as kind of like a series of projects. There's like, or you know, one way that I've put it before is kind of like, you know, my cards are like kind of like my personal like museum of the hobby. And there's like different wings of that museum that have different themes. So like one of those wings is like 1956 Tops. That's a pretty easy one. So another one is this 2016 Cubs from the World Series team. Another fun project that I put together was I just went onto Wikipedia and I looked up who were the first African American players to join Major League Baseball. So right, everybody knows Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby, but there's a whole bunch more players that came after that, obviously, and then you end up with Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and Ernie Banks.
What about
But
and like Satchel Paige, guys like that?
Exactly, yeah, Satchel Paige. There's a whole bunch of, and so I just looked at Wikipedia, and then I just made my own checklist for, I want to build a collection of the first 20 players to join Major League Baseball that have like a major issue like Topps or Bowman card, right? And then like one of my favorite posts I ever made on Instagram was I took all those cards and I just put above them the date that player joined Major League Baseball.
Oh, cool.
And so that was super cool because, there's Jackie Robinson on there. Like you said, there's Satchel Paige and Don Newcomb. And so it was a cool opportunity to explore like a lot of that history and to see like, it's crazy, right? Because baseball's integrating. These are probably some of the first African Americans that like some people in the country have ever seen, right? And they're seeing it like on this piece of cardboard, that came with their gum, right? And it's so cool to think about, what feelings and things people were processing as they were looking at these cards, right? And so I like to think about my collection as building on those kinds of projects of like things that mean something to me, and then I can turn that into, build my own checklist of like what cards kind of connect me to that, whatever that theme or idea is. And so those are kind of the ideas that I use to kind of guide the new projects that I start.
It's almost as if you could use your cards to tell a piece of history, to tell a real story, and that I like that. I try to think about that too. Like when I acquire cards that become a part of my collection, when I have kids one day, can I take out this card and be able to talk about this athlete, talk about this period of time? And that's where, like, yes, we talk about flipping on here and selling and, business side of it, but that's where being a collector, I think, is really all about. Being able to look at your cards and tell a story, whether it's a personal story and how you got that card, or a story about that player, about that year, anything that you could just give some piece of information about the past.
Yeah, I think that's a big deal. And I actually think that it's those kinds of things that ultimately will help like at least preserve the value of those things. So like when I'm collecting these cards of like these former like Negro League players, like right now a lot of them are really cheap, but I in my head that doesn't make sense to me. Like these people were like some of like the first integrators of sports in America. And like just because they're not Jackie Robinson, it's shocking to me that I could get like a really nice quality card of a person like Don Newcomb or Sam Jones from like a good example is Monty Irvin. So Monty Irvin is a Hall of Famer, and he probably would have been the first African American in baseball, if not for some things that happened with the Red Sox, and we can go into what happened. But anyway, he is someone who's in the Hall of Fame, and you can get his 1952 Topps card, which is one of the nicest looking cards you've ever seen, in like high eye appeal, like for like $125. Right. And of course, you can't get like Mickey Mantle for that, but that's a card from the same set, one of the most storied sets in the hobby of a guy who's a Hall of Famer and also like one of the first integrators. Like for me, there's no way that card is going to go down in value. And also it like means a lot. So I'm happy to own it. Right.
Yeah. I mean, who's to say that couldn't, you're challenging a hobby assumption right there. I mean, who's to say that couldn't become the next avenue that starts bubbling up? But even if it doesn't, as far as increasing in value, you have a personal attachment to it and a historical attachment to it. And I'm curious, because your collecting lane is unique, whatever tugs at your own personal heartstrings, how do you go about finding these cards? I mean, at the National, you got that Ernie Banks, cut autograph with the manufactured Cubs logo. That was awesome. So is it like a combination of shows, eBay, like how do you track these cards down?
Yeah, so I'm not really a big card show person. I think I'm just like not very good at card shows. It's like a little too overwhelming for me. And I think my what I'm looking for is maybe a little bit too specific. So it's just like really inefficient. So I get a lot of my cards from eBay, but I also get a lot of my cards from Instagram and from the message boards. So like I used to be, and somewhat to this day, a big person on like the blowout forums. For vintage, there's this really nice forum called Net54 where a lot of like the old dudes of the hobby hang out. And so, the people over there, it's a good atmosphere for, people don't have crap cards. They have really nice stuff. They kind of know what they have, but they also like are keen to make sure that it goes to like a good home. So I end up getting a lot of my cards from there. And maybe just to jump back to our previous topic really fast, another fun project that I did that was one of the most fun things I've done in the hobby was I got like one Cubs card from every set from T206 to 1991 Topps. And that was like so much fun because it was kind of like tracking all of what the Cubs were doing all over all those years. But it's also cool to see like the evolution of the design of baseball cards. And it was like one of the least expensive projects I've ever done because like who cares about like 1979 Topps Steve Stone? But like, it was so cool. And then it was like fun to just pick out like, okay, I'm picking out one Cub from this year. Like, who's it going to be, right? And then like look at all the cards and kind of figure out which one looks the coolest, and then spend whatever like $25 on a PSA 8 of this. So that was like that kind of stuff is so fun, and I feel like that's really at the root of like the hobby. Like it feels sometimes like it's like a money thing and that it's like a hype and prospecting thing, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like the people nerding out and going on, these random avenues. Those are I think ultimately that's really what the hobby is rooted in.
Listen, I remember opening packs of it must have been 2001, 2002 Topps, always either chasing or always finding Felix Paillet. He was a
Felix Paillet, yeah.
I swear to God, I remember seeing his cards like it was yesterday, and it was 20 years
ago.
Man,
I feel like all those guys were like super hyped up Cubs prospects that just they never really landed.
When does vintage start for you in your mind?
Oh yeah, that's a question that gets a lot of people really agitated. I mean, I feel like for me, because I'm an old dude, I think of like 79 and earlier as being and the reason I say 79 is because it was right around that time when like Fleer and Donruss started producing cards in addition to Topps. So like that was a pretty major transition into hobby when you didn't just have Topps anymore. Like another good one you could choose might be actually 89, right? Because that's when Upper Deck came, and there was kind of like suddenly there's a transition to the premium card. And so maybe you could say like pre-89 is vintage. I really also think it depends on the sport. And but for me, I usually think of it as like 79, but that doesn't really change my life in any way.
Okay, so in your mind, you're saying, Matthew, my 1980, and ever since I got it at the National, I've used almost any excuse to bring this card on the podcast. But
why not?
My 1980 Bird Magic triple rookie with Dr. J in the middle, PSA 5 with a 10 auto, all three signatures. So this just misses the cut by 1 year.
Well, I think I would say that for basketball, it's probably a different ball game. Because like when was the first season where there was actually more than just like Topps?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Valid question.
Right, because there was a shutdown between what, like 80 there's 81 Topps, right? But then you don't get another basketball set maybe until 86 Fleer.
You could be right on that, or 84 Star, but that's not like widely circulated, right?
Yeah, so I mean, and obviously, like by the time you get to once you get to 86 Fleer, then you've got Fleer products. But I don't remember when Topps started making cards again for basketball. I think it might have been 94, because that's when I remember in 94 there was a Jordan card where they had him on like the 84 Topps baseball style. But I don't know. I mean, also I think about maybe 89 might be a good demarcation for basketball, because that's when 89, 90 when Skybox came out, because then they were like, that was like in the midst of like, here's a butt ton of cards, and remember those brown bordered cards pretty well from that season.
I guess there is a 93 Topps basketball.
Okay.
I'm seeing 92, 93 Topps basketball as well. Wow, we're really going down a rabbit hole here.
Yeah.
This is great, because these are like several topics we've never talked about before mashed into one episode.
Nice.
But that's great. Craig, do you have anything more for Matthew here?
I think I am maxed out on I hit my vintage talk quota for the week. That is for sure.
For the week, maybe for the month.
But I definitely enjoyed learning about it because, like I said, this is not a topic we usually dive into, but we are very much so curious learners, as one of our podcast titles alludes to. The learning never stops. So I certainly hope for our listeners too, they learned a little bit something, and the passion definitely shows. So thank you for sharing some of your stories, some of your collection, and just getting a chance, like we said, to nerd out.
Yeah, super fun. And I guess I would also want to say that, like, I've been in the hobby a while, but I certainly don't. I know that I'm not done learning, right? And so that's part of the reason why I love like interacting with people who don't collect what I collect. Like you guys have a lot of interest in areas that I don't know much about, and it's just cool to see like what's driving people's interests and stuff like that. Yeah, like look at that. Like there you go, right?
Right. That's soccer. Who's that? Jude Bellingham, SGC 10.
Right. Like, Matthew, what do you know about 2021 Topps Chrome Bundesliga Sapphire Blacks out of 10?
I know I would get an F in that class. I could not take the final and pass.
But it looks cool.
It looks super cool. And the
You know
other thing
that
that I would know also that it's like a Topps Chrome. I can't imagine there are that many issues of Topps Chrome for football.
Oof. Nowadays there are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, Matthew. Thank you for coming on, sharing your not only your vintage and 1956 tops, which you can find Matthew at 1956 Tops Guy on Instagram, posting great stuff and constantly challenging hobby assumptions. But just thank you for sharing not only your nerd aspect, your enjoyment, but just taking the time to hang out with us here.
Yeah, it was a blast. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, guys. Peace.